And again, none of those things are going to earn you righteousness. In fact, Jesus warns that there will be people who will point to all of the things that they did in his name only to hear him say, I never knew you. And so the point is not necessarily about doing. It's about being with, of having that posture of heart of saying, God, I need you, and then moving from there. And so what we have to ask ourselves this morning, friends, what we have to ask ourselves is, what appetite have I been feeding the most in my life? Because the truth is that whatever we feed in our life, it will grow.
Are you a fan of the annual award shows from Hollywood each year? There were some I get into and some I don't, but from one of my recent devotions, I saw this. It says, when you include all of the technical and cinematic specialty events, there are more than 300 annual award shows in which the TV and film industry honors its own. That's a lot. In Jesus' day, it was typical for Israel's spiritual teachers to hand out awards as well, although not quite so literally. You see, they routinely announced their nominees for the men and women who were most blessed by God. Their proclamations went something like this: Blessed are the faithful and the obedient, and those who try with all their might to become very pleasing to God. Rigorously religious people came off looking quite good. Then along came Jesus. After he produced his own list of winners, spiritual achievement awards have never been quite the same. Jesus' statements are known as the Beatitudes, 8 declarations found in the Sermon on the Mount from the beginning of the 5th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. And if you've been following the church the past few weeks, Pastor Jacob has been teaching on this series of Beatitudes. We're several weeks in here. So understanding the Beatitudes is not rocket science. Rocket science is easy. At least rocket science follows known rules and principles. You see, Jesus' statements seem to violate every known assumption about spiritual vitality. You see, they turn upside down the world's most cherished values. The Beatitudes aren't guidelines for positive thinking or personal happiness. You see, they're descriptions of the kind of people who are able to get close to God and are therefore bound to experience the kind of life they have always wanted. So if Jesus were handing out spiritual Academy Awards, those expecting to win best performance by a righteous person are not going to be given any accepted speeches. He doesn't say, blessed are the comfortable, because that means God must be taking care of them. He says just the opposite. Only those who are desperate for God as their only security are likely to sell out to him. And unless we sell out to Jesus, we'll just play religious games in Jesus' name and call it going to church. So Daniel, let me bring you into the conversation. I'm curious if you have any of the award shows that you regularly watch and enjoy.
I watch like highlights of the AMAs, the American Music Awards, or I've been really into the past few years the ESPYs, or the ESPN Awards. I just like watching what they do with the hosts, and I just remember, I think it was 3 years ago when Keegan-Michael Key hosted, and all the like musical numbers they did, but that's about it.
I'm with you on those. There were bits and pieces I'll tune in, the music awards. I'll never sit through the whole thing. I just don't find it that entertaining, but there's some that I enjoy bits and pieces. Let's go into the scripture today. We're looking at Matthew 5:6 that says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. So have you ever been truly hungry? I know Jacob talked about that in his sermon about hungry for peanuts. I've been really hungry, and peanuts are not high on my list. But not just I could eat, but genuinely hungry after a long hike or a hard day of work or missing a few meals. But when you're that hungry, food becomes your focus. You aren't casually thinking about dinner. You long for it because your body knows it needs it. And if you're anything like me, I don't miss a meal. And when I do, I'm really hungry. For example, there was an office recently I was bringing ice cream to in Bowling Green, Kentucky. It was just last week. And I think it was the first time in my 25 years of sales that when we bring food, we can get something for ourselves that the company expenses. Basically, it's a way to get conversations to talk about a product. I knew I was having dinner in about 3 hours. And I thought, if I have any ice cream at all, I am not going to be hungry at all for dinner. But I tell you, it was hard. I was hungry, and that was some really good looking ice cream. It's hard when you're hungry for something like that. You see, Jesus uses that picture to describe the heart of a disciple. He doesn't say, blessed are those who occasionally think about righteousness. He says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. You see, Jesus is forming us, people whose deepest craving is not success, comfort, or even approval or pleasure, but God himself and the life that he calls for us to live. So first of all, we need to know that we all hunger for something. And Jacob also talked about this, right? Every person has an appetite for something. The question isn't whether we hunger. The question is what we're hungry for. Some hunger for success. Others hunger for comfort. Some hunger for approval, and others for money, experiences, relationships, achievements, or entertainment. And I can tell you in my life, I've hungered too often for some of those too much. And I bet you some of you have too. You see, none of those things are necessarily wrong. The problem comes when we expect them to satisfy what only God can. And I don't know about you, but whenever the movie Castaway comes on TV with Tom Hanks, you know, the deserted island, he's all by himself, I tune in. It's just interesting. So imagine you're stranded at sea in something like that, a deserted island. You're desperately thirsty. All around you is water, right? It looks refreshing, but the more salt water you drink, if you were to drink it, actually the more thirstier you become. You see, it promises relief. It actually makes things worse, though. The world often works the same way. It tells you if you just had more money, if you finally got that promotion, if everyone admired you, or if you found the perfect relationship, you know what, then you'd be satisfied. Yet people who have all those things, well, they're often to admit that they're empty, right? Because we were created for something deeper. As Augustine famously wrote, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you, God. I really like how Pastor Jacob pointed out what righteousness truly means, because it can be confusing. Righteousness means right relationships. Right relationships. And what does that mean? Well, righteousness is every part of our lives being brought into alignment with the will and the character of God. It's living rightly with creation, living rightly with the people around us, living rightly within ourselves, and above all, living in right relationship with God. So let's look at someone who was great at living this example of righteousness that Jesus taught on. No one had a better religious resume than the Apostle Paul, right? Philippians 3 lists his accomplishments. He had every reason to boast. But after meeting Jesus, Paul wrote this. He goes, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Jesus Christ. The things he once trusted became insignificant compared to knowing Jesus, because you see, his appetite changed. And that's what Jesus does to us. He doesn't just change behavior, he changes our desire. Next, God fills those who hunger for him. He fills us. Jesus promises they will be filled. And notice here, he doesn't promise that people who hunger for comfort will be filled, or success or popularity. He promises to satisfy those who hunger for righteousness. Here again, right relationships. So parents sometimes struggle with children who constantly snack. You see, they eat cookies all afternoon. Well, they're not hungry when dinner comes. The snack ruined their appetite for the meal they actually needed. Spiritually, we often fill ourselves with things that dull our hunger for God. Constant entertainment or business, constant scrolling, constant comparison. You know what? None of those will satisfy us. Maybe temporarily. They simply reduce our appetite for what truly gives life. Think of a modern example of this. Jim Elliot. He was a missionary and had every opportunity to pursue comfort and success. But instead, he gave his life taking the gospel in Huaorani people of Ecuador. And before his death, he wrote these famous words. He says, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." And then in January 1956, Jim Elliot, Nate Saint, Ed McCauley, Pete Fleming, and Roger Youderian set up a camp on a river sandbar in the
Ecuadorian
jungle. The goal? They wanted to make peaceful contact with the Huaorani people who were known for extreme violence against outsiders. But there was a tragedy here. After initial friendly contacts, a group of 10 Huaorani tribe members attacked the camp on January 8th, 1956, spearing all 5 missionaries to death without the men firing a single shot in self-defense. But there's a global impact with this. You see, the story was featured in a prominent Life magazine photo essay, inspiring thousands of people worldwide to pursue missionary work. Showing radical forgiveness, Jim's widow, Elizabeth Elliot, along with their young daughter Valerie and their pilot Nate Saint's sister Rachel, later moved to live inside the very village of the Rarney people who killed their loved ones. Through years of living with the tribe, translating the Bible and showing kindness, many of the tribe members, including even some of the men who participated in that deadly attack, came to accept Christ. Daniel, let me ask you, what was the most impactful part of Jacob's message for you this week?
For me, it was his illustration with the chocolate syrup and his point of thinking about what you feed and what you're giving time in your life, and if it's edifying or if it's good, or just that aspect of the thirst for righteousness doesn't come naturally. It's something you have to be right with God in order to see what needs done in the world.
And I love it. And we need to understand that this is a lifetime work. This isn't something we're going to achieve overnight. It's not something we're going to understand right away. We just, as Jacob pointed out, we live the righteousness and those right relationships. It's an application that we try over and over the rest of our lives to just get better and better at. So as we apply this into our lives, I want you to ask yourself, what do you think about the most? What disappoints you the most when you don't get it? What excites you the most when you receive it? You see, those questions often reveal what we're really hungry for. So Jesus invites us to examine our appetites. So do we hunger more for income or recognition, comfort, influence? Or do we hunger to know Christ, to become like him, to love what he loves? The wonderful news is that God doesn't shame us for having the wrong appetites. Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." And as Jacob taught us, righteousness simply centers around those right relationships. The world promises satisfaction but leaves us wanting more. Jesus promises satisfaction that reaches the deepest parts of our soul. He forms us into the people who stop trying to satisfy ourselves with just temporary things. He forms us into the people who stop trying to prove our goodness through our own works. And instead, we receive his righteousness by faith and begin longing to live lives that reflect his heart. So the greatest blessing isn't simply becoming a better person. The greatest blessing is discovering that Jesus himself is the bread of life. And when we hunger for him above everything else, we find the satisfaction that we've been searching for all along. Have a great week.
Like and subscribe.